In the Season 1 episode of SpongeBob titled Nature Pants, SpongeBob has an existential crisis over the grill while flipping Krabby Patties. In the midst of another mind-numbing shift at the Krusty Krab, he suddenly decides that he wasn't born to cook but to live free among the jellyfish. He quits his job, gives away his worldly possessions, and runs off into the wild to become one with nature. What follows is a kind of cartoon thought experiment. SpongeBob tries to abandon the industrial society of Bikini Bottom for a fantasized state of pure nature, only to find that his body, his habits, and even his senses simply don't fit the life of the jellyfish. By the end of the episode, he returns home as if nothing has changed, except that his original sense of dissatisfaction, the feeling that something is wrong with his work and his world, has never been fundamentally addressed. It's this gap between a failed return to nature fantasy and the untouched structure of his life that I will argue perfectly captures the impossibility of primitivism as both a philosophical and political movement.
No offense, Mr. Krabs, but I've been thinking about giving up my cold industrial life in favor of a more natural and free life among the jellyfish.
SpongeBob SquarePants appears here as one figure within a long philosophical tradition, traceable at least to the Romantic era, that idealizes a life in harmony with nature, free from the complexities, isolation, and struggles of the modern world. While this ideal is often attributed to what we now call anarcho-primitivism, its core can be traced back to the 18th century in the works of the Enlightenment philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau hypothesized, and it's important to stress that this was a hypothesis not based on an empirical study, an ideal representation of man in his so-called natural state, a view often read as a theory of the noble savage. According to Rousseau, this natural life included not only philosophical virtues such as justice and compassion, but also concrete goods such as health, well-being, and freedom from alienated labor. He writes, "The savage and the civilized man differ so much, that what constitutes the supreme happiness of one would reduce the other to despair. The former breathes only peace and liberty, he desires only to live and be free from labor. Civilized man, on the other hand, is always moving, sweating, toiling, and racking his brains. In the midst of so much philosophy, humanity, and civilization, we have nothing to show for ourselves but a frivolous and deceitful appearance, honor without virtue, reason without wisdom, and pleasure without happiness." Putting aside the obviously racist and colonial language at the time that was employed here, it is clear from the beginning that such a theory was imagined dialectically, formulated not from what little evidence we have of any so-called pre-civilizational people, but rather as an antithesis to modern society itself. And this is exactly how SpongeBob Nature Pants proposes his conception of natural life as well. Never something really conceived of in itself, but always in a sort of oppositional contrast to the lives of the civilized people of Bikini Bottom, such as Sandy, Patrick, and Mr. Krabs.
SpongeBob, of all the crazy schemes, why would you want to live among the jellyfish?
Oh, Sandy, that's exactly the response I would expect from someone who lives the sham of a life I once lived. I'm gonna prove...
The jellyfish in this episode function as an allegory for SpongeBob's own fallacious notion of the noble savage. They are transformed into a personification of an ideal that, in its very pontification, is meant to grant him a sort of freedom from the complexities of modern life. It is for this reason that every thinker of primitivism remains in the bounds of a political philosophy. But it is a political theory without any clear path or mechanism to actualize what it proposes. Unlike Marxism or even neo-feudalism, which have a practical empirical reality to point to, Rousseau and SpongeBob only have an allegorical dream of the past to gesture towards, with no real method in place to see it to its end. It is worth noting here that many argue that this theory of the noble savage is falsely attributed to Rousseau on this very basis, since he was self-aware of this complexity. Indeed, despite many ruminating passages from his work romanticizing such an ideal, he does not entirely reify the notion. He claims that it is difficult to form a true idea of a state which no longer exists, perhaps never did exist, and probably never will exist, and of which it is nevertheless necessary to have true ideas, in order to form a proper judgment of our present state. So, keep that in mind because it's crucial for where we're going. Rousseau is, in a fairly self-aware way, pointing out that any political philosophy which treats nature as a goal or destination is necessarily working within an idealization. SpongeBob, by contrast, takes that ideal at face value and thereby reifies it. He turns what was meant as a critical guiding ideal or thought experiment into a literal lifestyle choice. If we follow this thread from Rousseau forward, the fantasy of nature very quickly becomes a fantasy about labor. Rousseau's savage is not just morally pure, he is also less busy. The civilized man, as Rousseau writes, is always moving, sweating, toiling, and racking his brains, while the natural man desires only to live and be free from labor. In other words, already in the 18th century, the contrast between civilization and nature is framed as a contrast between alienated work done for others and minimal work done for oneself. That's exactly the hinge on which later anarcho-primitivists will turn. The idea that modernity has turned labor into an end in itself, an endless grind for profit, whereas the so-called primitive life involves only limited, self-directed effort, leaving the rest of the day open for dancing, singing, and dreaming. 1 century later, Marx and Engels radicalized this by making labor the central category of social critique. In their early writings on alienation, Marx describes how, under capitalism, workers are separated from the product they make, from the activity of making it, from their fellow workers, and even from their own species being. That is, their capacity to consciously and freely transform the world through their labor and see their signature stamped into the world as a result. At the same time, they imagine pre-class societies as forms of primitive communism, where production is organized around use and communal sharing rather than profit and wage labor. This doesn't mean that Marx and Engels were naive about a return to some prehistoric life. In fact, any suggestion of an arbitrary and nostalgic return to the past would have been detested by the pair as another mere utopic vision. But it does mean that the possibility of unalienated labor is for them historically grounded in earlier communal forms of life, not just some abstract moral ideal. Before delving further into how the dialectic of alienated labor and primitivism unfolded, we can locate these Marxist roots already at work in SpongeBob Nature Pants in the very first scene of the episode. SpongeBob's epiphany in Nature Pants doesn't come out of nowhere. It happens at the very assembly line of the grill, under the cold, fluorescent lights of the Krusty Krab kitchen. His revelation that he wasn't born to cook but to live among the jellyfish is an exemplary illustration of such a primitivist insight. SpongeBob suddenly experiences his everyday job as something external to him, something that doesn't belong to his very nature. And, seen from this angle, Mr. Krabs' reaction is a textbook example of ideological reinterpolation.
SpongeBob, you wouldn't last even 1 day in the wild. This is your natural habitat. This is your wide open range. These are your amber waves. And this is your golden scepter with which you rule.
Krabs immediately tries to stitch SpongeBob's sense of self back to his role as a worker, insisting that flipping Krabby Patties is already in his nature, and that the spatula is basically an extension of his body. In miniature, the scene stages the whole primitivist opposition. On one side, the dream of unalienated, playful activity with the primordial jellyfish, and on the other, the demand that SpongeBob recognize himself as nothing more than a standing reserve of labor power. It is important to note that, however liberatory this revelation for SpongeBob may have initially felt, its critical insight, like those of many primitivists, is philosophically immature since it is not generated from any real dialectical or material analysis of his circumstances. SpongeBob feels that his current life is cold and alienated, but lacks the language to articulate the how and the why, leading him to construct a false binary between life in contemporary society, which he senses to be bad, and natural or so-called primitive life, which he imagines or dreams to be good. That is, he fails to give a true expression to the suffering he experiences, so that all he has left is to place the blame on a vague notion of modern society for all his ills, which exists in contrast to a mere ideal of prehistoric life. And if it is simply modern society that is the problem, any type of antidote to such suffering cannot be realized collectively in that very society. Thus, liberation isn't framed as a mere individual feat against society at large, a society of sheep herded together by industrial forces, who are blind to the very suffering they face as a consequence. While collectivity among the jellyfish, or for primitivists among prehistoric communities, is idealized to take on a purified and harmonic form, in modern civilization any type of social collectivity is viewed by them in purely negative terms, since it always takes place for the purposes and ends of greater industrial society. Nonetheless, this type of immature critique SpongeBob exemplifies, which stood in stark contrast to Marx's dialectical materialism, had grown amongst the neo-romantic political milieu of the 19th century. It is important to remember that, whether or not we can fairly attribute a literal advocacy for primitivism in the writings of Rousseau, he became such a figure of influence in political philosophy that the intention behind his writings became obscured in a sea of interpretations. As Voltaire famously quipped after reading Rousseau, "One longs to walk on all fours." It is clear that Rousseau captured a common fantasy of the past lurking in the unconscious of Enlightenment society, one that would only accelerate along with the discontents of an increasingly industrialized society. Mikhail Bakunin, one of the most notorious anarchist thinkers of the 19th century, identified the rise of this type of political critique that had its basis in a fantastical past that was never truly present. Bakunin, lamenting upon the Rousseau-inspired political actors amongst his organizational ranks, writes that a radical revolt against society would be just as impossible for man as a revolt against nature, human society being nothing else but the last great manifestation or creation of nature upon this earth. And an individual who would want to rebel against society, that is, against nature in general and his own nature in particular, would place himself beyond the pale of real existence, would plunge into nothingness, into an absolute void, into lifeless abstraction. What Bakunin is pushing back against here is precisely SpongeBob's fantasy of liberation as a private exit from society. Bakunin, following Marx, does not see human nature as the supreme freedom of the individual. For him, there is no human nature that exists outside of or prior to social relations. There is only human nature as it concretely develops in and through them, which means that to oppose society in the abstract is to oppose nature itself and, by extension, one's own nature. In other words, the problem is not that we are social, or that we live in dense, interdependent networks of production and communication. The problem is rather how those networks are organized themselves. The individual who tries to stand outside society altogether, to invent a purity beyond the pale of real existence, as Bakunin puts it, doesn't become more natural. They rather dissolve into an abstraction, a kind of nowhere man. SpongeBob in the jellyfish fields is exactly this nowhere man. He has stepped out of his industrialized society, Bikini Bottom, but he quickly discovers that there is no world for him beyond it. No world other than the one he was already thrown into, both literally and ontologically. This is where the philosophy of Martin Heidegger becomes important for understanding nature pants and the impossibility of primitivism more generally. If you know anything about the history of philosophy, you probably are aware that Heidegger is not on Bakunin's side politically. Put it mildly, he's no anarchist revolutionary. But his ontology makes a similar yet more expansive structural point. For Heidegger, there is no human being first and a world added on later. Rather, to be human simply is to be a being in the world. We always already find ourselves in a web of meanings, roles, tools, and relationships that we did not choose, what Heidegger calls our thrownness into the world. Each being has a historicality or a heritage that extends far beyond itself, so that our world and our very essence is not a matter of any mere subjective choice. Haytham Abu Qadra, writing on this subject, shows how Dasein, a term Heidegger uses for our human way of being in the world, cannot originate or invent that which is not rooted in its own heritage, which it shares with others. Heritage is the ground in which every inventing is rooted, for inventing now means thinking from out of and into that which is inherited and shared. Thus, even though we can reinterpret our past and project new possibilities upon it, there is no mere arbitrary exit from our dwelling, no other world we could simply choose for ourselves at a whim. Even when SpongeBob imagines being jellyfish as something external to his society, that very projection itself is rooted in the heritage of Bikini Bottom, such as its language, images, and fantasies. This means SpongeBob's ideal can never be some pure, external nature that exists outside of his world. Even our very sense perceptions, which tend to be thought of as irreducibly natural, upon investigation are discovered to be most intimately related to our heritage-bound world. For example, Heidegger writes that what we first hear is never noises or complexes of sounds, but the creaking wagon, the motorcycle, and this fact serves as the phenomenological evidence that in every case, Dasein, as being in the world, already dwells alongside what is ready to hand within the world. For Heidegger, our senses and intuitions are never raw receptors for stimuli, as would be the case for Kant's philosophy. Rather, they're always tuned to a certain style of life. To be at home in the world means being accustomed to its pace, having the habits and skills that let its objects and activities show up as immediately meaningful. This phenomenology is illustrated in the episode when SpongeBob goes to live among the jellyfish. It's not just that he has the wrong political or ethical position that would prevent him from fitting in with other jellyfish. Instead, his very perceptual world doesn't correspond with that of the one he attempts to arbitrarily throw himself into. We see this more directly in the episode when, after failing to assimilate initially with the jellyfish, SpongeBob attempts to adapt to their local diet. The seaweed that the jellyfish delight in eating registers, for him, as disgusting, and his body's first instinct is to reject it by spitting it out. By contrast, when the smell of Krabby Patties drifts through the air later in the episode, this mass-produced, industrial food, the very symbol of the life SpongeBob has rejected, hits his nose as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The point, in Heideggerian terms, is that SpongeBob's senses, his moods, and his bodily know-how are all habituated to the equipmental world of Bikini Bottom. His attempt to renaturalize himself with the jellyfish fails not because nature is bad, but because there is no individual subjective view from nowhere where you can just reset your perceptual attunement and step into a brand new world. He is thrown into his world, the world of Bikini Bottom, and his very way of seeing, smelling, and enjoying things shows this, without any need for abstract or discursive argumentation. Heidegger himself wrote on the question of technology and industry in his essay entitled The Question Concerning Technology. While the full complexity of that text is beyond the scope of this video, one point is absolutely decisive for our purposes. Heidegger thinks both the Luddite or the primitivist, as well as the naive techno-optimist, are trapped in the same illusion. As he puts it, everywhere we remain unfree and chained to technology, whether we passionately affirm or deny it. Simply saying yes or no to technology leaves its hold on our world untouched. Accordingly, pushing on blindly with technology, as techno-optimists do, ultimately amounts to the same thing as rebelling helplessly against it and cursing it as the work of the devil. In both cases, technology remains the unquestioned ground of our way of life. We either worship it or flee from it, but we never learn to see or inhabit it differently. That is exactly what Nature Pants dramatizes at the conclusion of the episode. SpongeBob's attempt to reject the technological, industrial world and return to nature fails for all the phenomenological and political reasons we've just discussed. When he comes back from the jellyfish fields, he slips straight back into his old routines, only now a bit more grateful for them. But the structural problems that triggered his crisis in the first place, the alienated labor, the routinized life, the sense that something is wrong with how work and enjoyment are organized, remain untouched.
I made a huge mistake. Please forgive me.
Quit your blubbering and have a Krabby Patty.
Don't mind if I do.
And I'll see you at work first thing tomorrow morning.
SpongeBob's failed escape shows that returning to nature is not only not a real solution, but impossible. It leaves the technological and ontological ordering of his world intact. From a Heideggerian perspective, the challenge, instead, would be to transform how that world is revealed and inhabited, to find another way of dwelling within a technological environment, rather than dreaming of stepping outside of it altogether. Or, from a Marxist perspective, the challenge is collectively seizing the technological means of production so that it can be put towards the human ends of the proletariat rather than towards the inhuman ends of capital itself. In any case, the primitivist dream is collapsed into a mere individualist and romanticist fantasy, one with no real ontological or political poignancy, and one that ultimately offers no solution to the problems it inadequately addresses in the first place. So when SpongeBob stumbles back to the Krusty Krab, grateful to be flipping patties again, it's not because the jellyfish were bad and fast food is good. It's because there is no outside from which he can simply reboot his nature and choose a different world. The episode shows us that both the romantic fantasy of fleeing technology and the blind faith of embracing it leave the underlying problems untouched. The harder question, the one Rousseau mostly fails to grasp, and that Marx and Heidegger each radicalize in their own ways, is how to transform the world we're already in together. How to change the way labor, technology, and dwelling hang together, rather than dreaming of walking on all fours with the jellyfish forever.